I stood in my old bedroom, running my fingers along the edge of the wooden desk where I'd done homework for 12 years. The room felt smaller now, but every detail remained exactly as I'd left it. Same blue curtains, same model airplane hanging from the ceiling, same stack of books on the nightstand that my mom never made me put away. Being back here brought everything rushing back, especially that July 4th when I was 6. The whole town had turned out for the parade that year, just like every year. Main Street was packed with families spread out on blankets, kids running around with those little plastic flags, everyone eating cotton candy and waiting for the fire trucks to roll by. I remembered sitting on the curb next to Carrie Johnson from my first grade class. She had pigtails and was wearing this bright yellow dress with tiny flowers on it. The marching band was playing something loud and off-key when I turned to ask Carrie if she wanted to share my popcorn. But she wasn't there anymore, just gone. Her spot on the curb was empty, like she'd never been sitting there at all. I looked around thinking maybe she'd gone to find her parents or use the bathroom, but I couldn't see her anywhere in the crowd. The weird part was how nobody else seemed to notice. The parade kept going. People kept cheering. Kids kept waving their flags, like nothing had happened. I tugged on my dad's shirt and pointed to where Carrie had been sitting. Where'd she go? Dad glanced over, then back at the parade floats. Who, buddy? Carrie. She was right here. I'm sure she's around somewhere, he said, but his voice sounded funny, tight. Look, here come the veterans. Mom leaned down and put her hand on my shoulder. Maybe she went to find her family, she said, but she was looking at Dad when she said it, not at me. After the parade, I asked around. None of the other kids seemed to remember Carrie being there. When I brought her up at dinner the next night, my parents exchanged one of those quick looks that adults think kids don't notice. The Johnson family moved away, sweetie, Mom said, cutting up my chicken into smaller pieces even though I'd been using a knife for months. Sometimes families have to leave town suddenly for work, but she didn't say goodbye. Sometimes there isn't time, Dad said. He was eating faster than usual, not really looking at his food. Within a week, it was like Carrie Johnson had never existed. The other kids in my class forgot about her completely. When I asked Mrs. Peterson about the empty desk where Carrie used to sit, she looked confused for a second before saying, "Oh, that's for new students." But I couldn't forget. Carrie had been real. I remembered her laugh, the way she always raised her hand first during reading time, how she shared her crayons with everyone. I remembered her yellow dress and the gap between her front teeth. As I got older, I started paying closer attention during the July 4th parades, not to the floats or the music, but to the people. I'd scan the crowd, looking for faces I recognized, counting the kids I knew. When I was 10, it happened again. Billy Martinez was there at the start of the parade, playing with some older boys near the bandstand. By the time the last float passed by, Billy was gone. Same story from the adults. Family moved away suddenly for work. Same blank looks from the other kids when I brought up Billy's name a few days later. I started keeping a list in a notebook I hid under my mattress. Carrie Johnson, 1989. Billy Martinez, 1993. Tommy Rodriguez, 1997. Every 4 years, like clockwork. Always during the July 4th parade. Always a kid between 5 and 7 years old. Always the same explanation. The summer I turned 14, I couldn't take it anymore. I'd been carrying this knowledge for 8 years, watching my parents act like everything was normal while kids kept disappearing. I waited until after dinner, when we were all in the living room. Dad was reading the newspaper. Mom was doing a crossword puzzle. "I need to ask you something," I said. Dad lowered his paper. "What's up, son?" What really happened to Carrie Johnson? The change in the room was immediate. Dad went completely still, his newspaper frozen halfway down. Mom's pen stopped moving across her puzzle. "We told you, honey," Mom said, but her voice was different, careful. Her family moved away. What about Billy Martinez? Tommy Rodriguez? They all moved away too, right? All during the July 4th parade? Dad folded his newspaper and set it on the coffee table. His hands were shaking slightly. Daryl. Every 4 years, I continued. I've been keeping track. It's always the same. Kid disappears during the parade. Family supposedly moves away suddenly. Nobody talks about it afterward. Mom stood up fast, her crossword book falling to the floor. She came over and grabbed my shoulders, her fingers digging in tight enough to hurt. You need to stop this, she said. You need to stop asking these questions. But why won't anyone tell me the truth? Dad got up from his chair. He looked older suddenly, like the conversation had aged him 10 years. He walked over to where Mom was holding me and put his hand on the back of my head. Some things, he started, then stopped, took a deep breath. Some things are bigger than us, son. Bigger than what we want or what we think is right. That doesn't make sense. Dad and Mom looked at each other over my head. One of those long, silent conversations that married people have with just their eyes. Finally, Dad nodded slightly. Keep walking, he said. I stared at him. What? Keep walking, he repeated. That's all I can tell you right now. When you're older, when you have to, you'll understand what that means. But I don't understand now. Mom pulled me against her, hugging me tight. Someday you will, she whispered into my hair. I hope not, but you probably will. They never brought it up again after that night. If I tried to ask more questions, Dad would just shake his head and say, keep walking. Like those 2 words were supposed to explain everything. 2 years later, they were dead. Car accident on Highway 9, heading home from grocery shopping on a Saturday afternoon. Truck ran a red light and hit them head on. The driver said his brakes failed, but the police couldn't find anything wrong with his vehicle. I inherited the house, their savings, and 1,000 questions that would never get answered. Whatever they'd been trying to tell me with those cryptic words died with them on that rainy October day. But I never forgot. Not Carrie's yellow dress, not the pattern I'd discovered, not the fear in my parents' eyes when I confronted them about it, and especially not those 2 words that seemed to mean everything and nothing at all. Keep walking. The mortgage papers still had my parents' names on them when I moved Sarah and Nate into the house 20 years later. I'd been meaning to get that fixed, but somehow seeing Robert and Emily Smith typed out in official font made it feel like they were still part of the place. Like their presence lingered in the walls, in the creaky floorboard by the kitchen sink, in the way the front door stuck when it rained. Sarah had wanted to buy something newer when we got married. Maybe one of those developments they'd built on the east side of town. Clean lines, modern appliances, yards that didn't require 3 decades of understanding to maintain properly. But I couldn't bring myself to leave. This house held answers I was still trying to decode, conversations that felt unfinished even after all these years. Daddy, look! Nate's voice cut through my thoughts. He was crouched by the garden bed, pointing at something in the dirt with the intense focus that only 3-year-olds could manage. I walked over and knelt beside him. A beetle was making its way across the mulch, carrying what looked like a piece of leaf twice its size. He's working really hard, Nate observed. Yeah, he is. I watched the beetle navigate around a small rock that probably seemed like a mountain from its perspective. Sometimes you have to carry heavy things. Nate nodded seriously, like this was profound wisdom he needed to remember. Then he stood up and ran toward the sandbox Sarah had installed last spring, his attention already moved on to something else. I stayed crouched by the garden, pulling a few weeds that had sprouted near the tomato plants. The motion was automatic, learned from watching my dad perform the same ritual every summer evening. He'd work his way along each row, checking for pests, adjusting stakes, muttering complaints about slugs or praise for particularly promising fruit. I'd follow behind him sometimes, trying to help but mostly just listening to his running commentary about soil conditions and weather patterns. Now I understood that the gardening had been meditation for him, a way to focus on something controllable while bigger, darker thoughts churned underneath. The calendar on our refrigerator showed June 28th, 6 days until July 4th, 4 years since Tommy Rodriguez had supposedly moved away with his family during the parade. 4 years since the last time the pattern had completed its cycle. I'd been counting down without really meaning to, the way you might find yourself holding your breath before walking past a cemetery. The math was inescapable. 1989, 1993, 1997, 2001. Every 4 years, like some horrible election schedule that nobody talked about but everybody seemed to know. "Honey, can you grab the laundry basket from upstairs?" Sarah called from inside the house. I stood up, brushing dirt off my knees. Through the kitchen window, I could see her folding towels at the dining room table, her movements efficient and precise. She'd gotten a promotion at the bank 3 months ago, assistant manager of commercial lending, and she approached everything with the same methodical attention she brought to loan applications. The laundry basket was in our bedroom, filled with Nate's small clothes and a few of my work shirts. I carried it downstairs, passing the framed photos that lined the hallway. Our wedding picture, Nate's first steps, Sarah's college graduation. Normal family moments that felt almost aggressive in their ordinariness. "Thanks," Sarah said, taking the basket. She shook out one of Nate's t-shirts, something with a cartoon dinosaur on the front. "Mrs. Peterson stopped by earlier. She wanted to know if we're planning to enter Nate in the children's costume contest at the parade." My hands went still on the towel I was folding. "What did you tell her?" "That we'd think about it. He'd look cute as a little Uncle Sam or something." Sarah smiled, but then noticed my expression. "What's wrong?" I set the towel down carefully. We'd had versions of this conversation before, circling around the edges of something I couldn't quite explain and she couldn't quite dismiss. "Maybe we should skip the parade this year." "Skip it?" "Daryl, it's the biggest thing that happens in this town. Nate's been talking about the fire trucks for weeks. We could drive to the lake instead, make it a family day, just the 3 of us." Sarah stopped folding and looked at me directly. "You're doing it again." "Doing what?" "Getting weird about July 4th. Last year you wanted to leave town that weekend, remember? And the year before that you kept asking if we could go visit my parents instead." I picked up another towel, giving my hands something to do. "I just think it might be nice to avoid the parade because of your theory about kids disappearing." Sarah's voice was patient but firm, the tone she used when she thought I was being unreasonable. "Honey, we've talked about this." We had talked about it. Multiple times. I'd tried explaining the pattern, the timing, the way families would suddenly move away without any forwarding address. Sarah would listen, ask reasonable questions, then point out all the logical explanations I was ignoring. Families moved for jobs, for better schools, for cheaper housing. Small towns had high turnover. Memory was unreliable, especially childhood memory, mixed up with trauma and loss. "What about Tommy Rodriguez?" I asked, even though I knew what she'd say. "His dad got transferred. You know that. The plant in Millerville offered him a supervisor position. Did you ever actually talk to anyone who saw them packing? Who helped them load the truck?" Sarah set down the shirt she was holding. "Daryl, I'm serious. Did anyone actually witness them moving out? People don't usually broadcast their entire moving process to the neighborhood. They probably wanted privacy. Or they never moved at all." The words hung in the air between us. Sarah's expression shifted from patience to something sharper, more concerned. "What exactly are you suggesting happened to them?" I couldn't answer that, not directly, because the truth sounded insane even inside my own head, and I'd been living with it for 20 years. How could I explain to my practical, logical wife that our peaceful little town had been built on something horrible? That the low crime rates and economic stability she appreciated came with a price nobody talked about? I don't know, I said finally. I just know something's not right. Sarah walked around the table and put her hands on my shoulders. Baby, I know you went through a lot when you were young. Losing your parents, feeling like nobody would answer your questions about those kids who moved away. But you can't let that fear control our whole lives. What if I'm right, though? What if there really is a pattern? Then we'll deal with it when we have actual evidence. But I'm not going to uproot our family or hide from community events because of a feeling. She was right, of course. From her perspective, I was being paranoid and overprotective. She didn't have the memories I carried, didn't see the looks that passed between certain longtime residents when they thought nobody was watching. She hadn't grown up cataloging disappearances and noting the careful way adults changed the subject whenever questions got too specific. Besides, Sarah continued, I just started this new position. Mr. Garrett is finally trusting me with the bigger accounts. I can't just disappear for a long weekend right when I'm trying to prove myself. I nodded, understanding the career implications. Sarah had worked hard to get where she was, and small-town banks didn't offer many opportunities for advancement. She'd been passed over twice before getting this promotion, and I knew she felt like she was constantly having to prove she belonged in the role. You're right, I said. I'm sorry. I just worry sometimes. I know you do. And I love that you want to protect us. But Nate deserves to grow up in a normal place, doing normal things. The parade is fun. The whole town comes together. Everyone's happy. Kids get to see the fire trucks up close. Those are good memories. Through the dining room window, I could see Nate in the backyard, now sitting in his sandbox and carefully building what looked like a small castle. He was talking to himself, probably narrating some elaborate story about knights or dinosaurs or whatever had captured his imagination today. He looked completely content, safe in his own little world. Sarah was right about him deserving normal experiences. I'd been so focused on the dangers I remembered that I hadn't considered what I might be taking away from him. Maybe the pattern was just coincidence. Maybe I'd been carrying around childhood fears for so long that I couldn't see past them. But then I thought about Mrs. Peterson stopping by to ask about the costume contest. Mrs. Peterson, who'd been my first grade teacher, who'd told me that empty desk was for new students when I asked about Carrie. She would have been in her 40s then, old enough to remember every student who'd passed through her classroom. Old enough to know that Carrie Johnson hadn't just moved away. The way she'd smiled when Sarah mentioned the contest. Friendly and encouraging, like any neighbor looking forward to a community celebration. But there had been something else in her expression, something I'd caught just for a second before she'd turned to leave. Pity, maybe, or guilt. I'll pick up some fabric this week, Sarah said, returning to the laundry. Maybe we can put together a little Revolutionary War soldier costume. Nothing too elaborate. I watched her fold another small shirt, her movements precise and domestic. She was planning our son's participation in an event that, according to the pattern I'd been tracking for 20 years, could be the most dangerous day of his young life. But I couldn't say that, not without sounding completely unstable. That sounds great, I said instead. Over the next few days, I found myself paying attention to things I'd never really noticed before. The way conversations would pause when I walked into the hardware store with Nate, how certain longtime residents would look at him with expressions that seemed almost apologetic. The fact that several families with young children had suddenly decided to visit relatives that first weekend in July, plans that seemed to have been made very recently. The Hendersons were taking their 4-year-old daughter to see her grandparents in Ohio. The Martins had decided to go camping with their twin boys, who were 5. 3 different families with children in that vulnerable age range, all choosing to be somewhere else during the town's biggest celebration. Maybe it was coincidence. Or maybe some parents had learned to read the signs I was just beginning to understand. I started walking different routes through town when I took Nate to the park or the grocery store, not avoiding anything specific, just varying the pattern, keeping us visible and accountable. If something was going to happen, it would be harder to explain if people had seen us around town regularly, if they knew our routines and habits. Sarah noticed the changes but didn't comment directly. She'd catch me checking the locks twice before bed, or see me glance around parking lots before getting Nate out of his car seat. Small behaviors that probably seemed like general anxiety rather than anything specific. "Maybe you should talk to someone," she suggested one evening while we were getting ready for bed. "About what?" "The worry. The way you've been lately. Dr. Martinez is supposed to be really good. Some of the women at work have recommended him." I brushed my teeth, considering the suggestion. What would I tell a therapist? That I believed my hometown had been sacrificing children for generations? That my 3-year-old son might be next? That my own parents had died with secrets they'd tried to pass on through cryptic warnings I was only beginning to understand? "I'll think about it," I said. But I knew I wouldn't. Whatever was happening in Willow Creek, it was bigger than individual psychology. It was woven into the fabric of the place, accepted and maintained by people who'd learned to live with terrible knowledge. The proof was in the silence. Not just the way certain subjects got changed, but the active, deliberate forgetting that seemed to happen every few years. The way children's names got scrubbed from memory like they'd never existed at all. I'd been living in that silence my whole life, carrying questions that nobody would answer. Now I had a son of my own, and the weight of protecting him felt heavier than anything I'd ever carried. Outside our bedroom window, Willow Creek looked exactly like what it was supposed to be. A quiet, safe, prosperous small town where families could raise their children without worry. The streetlights cast gentle circles of warmth, and the houses stood solid and permanent, filled with people sleeping peacefully. But I knew what lay underneath that peaceful surface, and in 6 days, I was going to have to decide whether to trust the appearance or the pattern, whether to keep walking, like my father had taught me, or finally stand still and face whatever had been hunting the children of Willow Creek for longer than anyone cared to remember. The morning air carried the scent of kettle corn and sunscreen as we walked toward Main Street. Nate bounced between Sarah and me, wearing the Revolutionary War soldier costume she'd finished the night before. The blue felt jacket hung loose on his small frame, and the tricorn hat kept sliding over his eyes, but he seemed proud of the outfit. "Daddy, will the fire trucks have their sirens on?" he asked for the 3rd time since breakfast. "Probably," I said, scanning the crowd ahead of us. Families were already claiming spots along the parade route, spreading blankets and setting up folding chairs. Kids ran around with miniature flags, their excited chatter mixing with the distant sound of the high school marching band warming up somewhere down the street. Sarah adjusted the small backpack she'd packed with snacks and water bottles. "Mrs. Chen said the spot in front of the bank is always good. We can see everything from there." I nodded, though my attention was focused on the other families around us. The Williamses had their 6-year-old daughter between them, both parents keeping hands on her shoulders as they walked. Mr. Rodriguez from the hardware store carried his grandson, a boy around 4, even though the kid looked perfectly capable of walking on his own. Everyone seemed more careful than usual, more protective. We found a place near the front of the crowd, close enough that Nate would have a clear view of the parade floats. Sarah lifted him onto her shoulders, and he clapped his hands together, the tricorn hat finally staying put. "Look at all the people," he said, pointing at the crowd stretching in both directions down Main Street. The atmosphere should have been purely festive. Neighbors chatted while they waited. Teenagers from the high school walked past in their band uniforms, and someone had set up a face painting station that already had a line of kids waiting. But I caught subtle things that didn't fit the celebration. Conversations that stopped when certain families walked by. Parents who kept checking their watches or glancing toward the side streets. The Hendersons weren't there. Neither were the Martins. 3 other families with young children that I'd expected to see were also missing from their usual spots. "The band's coming!" someone called out, and the crowd shifted forward slightly. The Willow Creek High School marching band rounded the corner onto Main Street, playing a patriotic song that was only slightly off-key. Behind them came the first float, decorated with red, white, and blue streamers and carrying what looked like the entire town council waving at the crowd. Nate cheered from Sarah's shoulders, his small hands clapping together. For a moment, watching his genuine excitement, I almost let myself believe that maybe this year would be different. Maybe the pattern I'd been tracking was just coincidence. Just the paranoid fears of someone who'd lost too much too young. Then I noticed Mrs. Peterson standing about 20 feet away. She was watching Nate with an expression I recognized from my childhood. That same look of pity mixed with guilt that I'd seen in adult faces whenever certain subjects came up. She caught my eye and looked away quickly, focusing on the parade floats with forced enthusiasm. The Vintage Car Club drove by next, their restored vehicles gleaming in the morning sun. Mr. Garrett from the bank waved from a 1957 Chevrolet, and Sarah waved back, pointing him out to Nate. "That's Mommy's boss," she explained. I kept scanning the crowd, noting which parents had their children close and which seemed more relaxed. The Johnsons were there with their twin daughters, but both girls were staying right between their parents instead of running around like kids usually did at these events. Mrs. Martinez had her grandson's hand firmly in hers, not letting him move more than a few inches away. The fire trucks came next, and Nate practically vibrated with excitement on Sarah's shoulders. The firefighters were throwing candy to the kids, and several children broke away from their parents to collect the pieces that landed on the pavement. But not many. Most parents called their kids back quickly, making excuses about not eating candy off the ground or waiting until later for treats. "Daddy, can I get some candy?" Nate asked. "Maybe later, buddy. Let's just watch for now." Sarah gave me a questioning look, but I pretended not to notice. A piece of wrapped chocolate had landed right at our feet, well within reach. But I didn't want Nate leaving the space between us even for a second. The parade continued with more floats, local business displays, and a group of veterans marching together. The crowd cheered and applauded. Kids waved their flags, and everything looked exactly like it was supposed to. A perfect small-town celebration, except for the undercurrent of tension I could feel from certain families. The way some parents kept checking the time, the fact that several longtime residents were missing entirely. About halfway through the parade, as the local Rotary Club float passed by with members tossing more candy, Nate shifted on Sarah's shoulders. "Mommy, I need to go potty." Sarah looked around, then pointed toward the back of the crowd. "There are some portable bathrooms over there. Can you wait a few more minutes?" "I really need to go," Nate said, and I could hear the urgency in his voice that meant we couldn't wait. "I'll take him," I said quickly. "Are you sure? I can carry him over there." "No, I've got it." I reached up and helped Nate down from Sarah's shoulders. "We'll be right back." I took his hand firmly, maybe tighter than necessary, and began weaving through the crowd toward the portable facilities that had been set up behind the main gathering. Nate walked beside me, still excited about the parade, but focused on his more immediate need. "Daddy, did you see the big flag on that truck?" I did. Pretty impressive. The music from the marching band was starting to fade as we moved away from the main crowd. Fewer people were standing back here, mostly parents with other children who needed bathroom breaks or families taking a rest from the excitement. The portable bathrooms stood in a row near the back parking lot behind Main Street. I could still hear the parade music, but it was muffled now, competing with normal conversation and the sound of car doors closing as latecomers tried to find parking. "Which one, buddy?" I asked, looking at the row of facilities. Nate pointed to the one on the end. I walked over and pulled the door open, checking inside to make sure it was clean and safe. The small space looked fine, just a standard portable bathroom with the usual supplies. "Okay, go ahead. I'll be right here." Nate climbed up the single step and closed the door behind him. I stood directly outside, facing the crowd and the parade route, keeping the bathroom door at my back. A few other parents were scattered around the area with their own children, everyone managing the logistics of a long public event. The parade music shifted to something louder, probably the grand finale float. I checked my watch and realized we'd been here about 30 seconds. Nate was usually quick about these things, but I didn't want to rush him. I turned around to ask if he was almost finished. The bathroom door was open. Empty. "Nate!" I called, looking inside the facility again, even though I could clearly see it was vacant. I spun back around, scanning the immediate area. A few families were walking back toward the parade route, kids in tow, but none of them was my son. The parking lot behind me held maybe a dozen cars and nobody else. "Nate!" I called louder, walking quickly in a circle around the bathroom area. "Nate, where are you?" On the ground near where I'd been standing, a small American flag lay in the dirt, the kind that kids had been waving during the parade, the kind that Nate had been carrying when we walked over here, but Nate was gone. I ran toward the closest family, a couple with a daughter around 8 years old. "Did you see a little boy? About 3, wearing a blue Revolutionary War costume?" They looked at me with polite confusion. "No, sorry." "Is everything okay?" I ran to the next group, then the next, asking the same question and getting the same response. Nobody had seen Nate. Nobody had noticed anything unusual. The parade music was getting louder, which meant the final floats were passing by. I ran back toward the main crowd, pushing through families and calling my son's name. "Nate! Nate!" But my voice was lost in the celebration, drowned out by the marching band and the cheers of the crowd. I reached the spot where Sarah was still standing, her face turning from confusion to alarm as she saw me running toward her alone. "Where's Nate?" she asked. "He's gone," I said, the words coming out as barely more than a whisper. "He's gone." The pattern had claimed its victim. After 20 years of watching and waiting and dreading this day, it had taken my son, just like Carrie Johnson, just like Billy Martinez and Tommy Rodriguez, just like my father had tried to warn me it would. I pushed through the crowd with desperate energy, grabbing shoulders and turning people around to face me. The parade was still going, music and laughter filling the air, but none of it mattered anymore. "Have you seen a little boy?" 3 years old, blue Revolutionary War costume. I asked a man holding a beer and watching the floats. He glanced at me briefly, then back at the parade. "Nope." I moved to the next group, a family with teenagers. "My son is missing. Small boy, about this tall, wearing a tricorn hat." The mother looked annoyed at being interrupted. "Sorry, we're trying to watch the parade." Person after person gave me the same response. Polite dismissal, mild irritation at being bothered, complete lack of concern that a toddler had vanished in broad daylight during a crowded public event. They acted like I was asking about a lost wallet instead of a missing child. I kept moving through the crowd, my voice getting hoarse from calling Nate's name. Some people turned to look when I shouted, but their expressions held curiosity rather than alarm. like they were watching a mildly interesting street performance instead of a parent in crisis. "Nate! Nate, where are you?" A woman with a stroller moved away from me, pulling her own child closer, but she didn't offer to help search. Nobody did. That's when Sarah found me, pushing through the crowd with her face twisted in confusion and growing panic. "What's happening? Where is he?" she demanded. "He's gone. I looked everywhere around the bathrooms, asked everyone back there. Nobody saw anything." Sarah's face went white. "That's impossible. He was just with you 5 minutes ago." "I know, but he's not there." She grabbed my arm. "We need to call the police. Right now." I nodded, but as we started looking around for help, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The adults nearest to us had turned away, suddenly very interested in the parade floats. Conversations that had been happening around us died out completely. An older man I recognized from the hardware store was standing about 10 feet away. When I caught his eye, he looked at me with an expression I'd seen before. Sad, almost apologetic, but he said nothing, just gave a small nod and turned back to watching the marching band. Mrs. Chen from the post office was doing the same thing, watching me with pity in her eyes but keeping her mouth shut. "We need to find a police officer," Sarah said, scanning the crowd, but I wasn't seeing any uniforms. During past parades, there had always been at least 2 or 3 officers managing traffic and keeping an eye on things. Today, I couldn't spot a single one. "Sarah," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "keep looking through the crowd. Check every family with kids, ask everyone you can find. I'm going to..." I paused, not sure how to explain what I was thinking. "I'm going to check somewhere else." "Where?" "Daryl, we need to stick together and search systematically." "I know, but trust me on this. Keep asking people. Keep calling his name. If you find him or if you find a cop, call my phone immediately." She looked like she wanted to argue, but the urgency of the situation overrode everything else. "Okay, but don't go far. We need to organize this properly." I kissed her forehead quickly and then walked away from the parade route, leaving behind the music and the crowd and the terrible indifference of people who seemed to know exactly what had happened, but weren't going to say a word about it. Keep walking. My father's words came back to me with sudden clarity. Not advice to ignore problems or avoid confrontation. Instructions, literal directions about what to do when this moment arrived. Because he'd known it would arrive. Just like his father probably knew, and his father before that. I walked away from Main Street, past the businesses and the crowd, following some instinct I didn't fully understand but couldn't ignore. My feet seemed to know where they were going even though my brain was still catching up. The Methodist church sat on a side street 2 blocks from the parade route. I'd walked past it hundreds of times over the years, a simple white building with a small cemetery beside it and woods beyond that. Normal, small-town church that held services on Sunday and community meetings during the week. But as I approached the back of the building, something looked different. Or maybe I was seeing it differently, noticing details that had always been there, but never registered as significant. Behind the church, where the mowed grass met the tree line, there was a break in the vegetation. Not random or natural, but deliberate. A narrow opening between 2 oak trees that led into the woods. I walked closer and saw what I'd somehow missed my entire life. Small stones arranged in a pattern on either side of the opening. Not decorative landscaping, but markers. A sign for people who knew how to read it. The trail beyond the opening was barely visible, just a worn path through undergrowth that looked like it had been used regularly for a very long time. The dirt was packed smooth in places, creating a clear route that curved down the hillside toward the denser woods surrounding Willow Creek. I looked back toward town, where I could still hear the distant sounds of the parade. Sarah was somewhere in that crowd, searching for our son, and probably getting the same polite dismissals I'd received. She'd keep looking because that's what any normal parent would do in a normal town where children didn't just vanish into thin air. But this wasn't a normal town. And I wasn't the first parent to stand at this spot, staring at this trail, understanding that everything I'd believed about my home had been built on lies. The path stretched ahead of me, disappearing around a bend where the trees grew thicker. It looked ancient, like it had been there longer than the church, longer than most of the buildings in town. The kind of route that got passed down through generations, maintained by people who understood its importance but never spoke about it openly. I thought about all the times my father had walked through these woods, supposedly just hiking or hunting. All the evenings he'd come home with dirt on his boots and a distant look in his eyes. All the conversations that had stopped when I entered the room, the warnings that had been too cryptic to understand until this moment. Other parents had walked this trail before me. Tommy Rodriguez's father 4 years ago. Billy Martinez's father before that. Carrie Johnson's parents back when I was 6 years old and too young to understand what I was witnessing. They'd all stood where I was standing now, faced with the same terrible realization that their child's disappearance wasn't random or accidental, that it was part of something bigger, something that had been happening in Willow Creek for longer than anyone wanted to admit. The parade music was getting fainter as I stood there, replaced by the normal sounds of the woods, birds calling, leaves rustling in the breeze, the distant sound of water moving somewhere deeper in the forest. I started walking down the trail, following the path that other desperate parents had taken before me. Each step felt inevitable, like I was completing a journey that had started 20 years ago when I first asked my parents what had really happened to Carrie Johnson. The packed dirt under my feet told its own story. This wasn't a hiking trail or a deer path. It was something else entirely. Worn smooth by decades of use by people who had had no choice but to follow it to whatever waited at the end. As I walked deeper into the woods, the last sounds of the parade faded completely, replaced by the quiet that comes from being far away from town and civilization. But I wasn't alone out here. I could feel the presence of everyone who'd walked this path before me. All the parents who'd been forced to learn what Willow Creek really was and what it demanded in exchange for its prosperity. The trail curved to the right, leading me further downhill. I couldn't see where it was going, but I knew I had to follow it. Not just because Nate was somewhere ahead of me, but because this was what my father had been preparing me for my entire life. Keep walking. I kept walking. The trail curved through a section where the trees grew so thick that only scattered patches of sunlight reached the ground. I could still hear distant parade music, but it seemed to come from another world entirely. My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah, but I didn't stop to check it. Whatever she'd found or hadn't found back in that crowd of people who acted like missing children were perfectly normal. It could wait. The path began to slope more steeply downward, winding between massive oak trees that looked older than anything else in Willow Creek. Their roots had grown across the trail in places, creating natural steps that had been worn smooth by decades of foot traffic. I had to grab onto low branches a few times to keep my balance as the descent grew sharper. About a quarter mile from where I'd started, the trail made an abrupt turn to the left and seemed to disappear completely. I stopped, looking around for any sign of where it continued. The trees formed a thick wall in front of me, and undergrowth filled the spaces between their trunks. But as I moved closer, I noticed that some of the vegetation looked different, arranged differently. I pushed aside a curtain of hanging vines and found myself looking at bare rock. The hillside rose up in front of me, gray stone covered with moss and decades of growth. But the vines hadn't been growing randomly. They'd been trained to hang in a specific pattern, creating a natural screen. Behind them, carved into the rock face, was an opening just wide enough for a person to walk through. The entrance was old, Not something that had been blasted or dug recently, but carved by hand tools, probably generations ago. The edges were smooth, weathered by time and rain, but someone had been maintaining it. The vines were healthy and positioned to hide the opening completely from anyone who didn't know exactly where to look. I pulled out my phone and turned on the flashlight. The beam showed rough stone walls extending back into darkness, with what looked like steps carved into the floor. The air coming from inside was cool and dry, carrying a smell that reminded me of old basements and storage rooms. Every instinct I had told me not to go into that hole in the ground, but Nate was somewhere in this darkness, and I'd already come too far to turn back now. I squeezed through the opening and started down the carved steps. My phone's light bounced off the stone walls, revealing a tunnel that had been cut with remarkable precision. The ceiling was high enough that I didn't have to duck, and the walls were smooth except for occasional alcoves that might have once held torches or lanterns. The steps continued down for what felt like 50 feet, maybe more. Far enough that I was definitely underground now, moving beneath the hillside toward the center of town. The air stayed cool and dry, and I could hear my own breathing echoing off the stone walls. Then the tunnel opened up. I stepped into a space so large that my phone's flashlight couldn't reach the far walls. The beam showed rough stone floors and what looked like support beams made from massive wooden posts. But these weren't modern construction materials. The wood was dark with age, hewn from trees that must have been enormous. Everything about the chamber suggested it had been here for a very long time. As I walked further into the space, playing my light across the walls and ceiling, I began to understand the scope of what I was seeing. This wasn't just a cave or natural formation. Someone had carved out a huge underground room beneath Willow Creek, supported it with timber that probably came from the original forest, and maintained it for decades, or maybe centuries. In the center of the chamber, illuminated by my phone's weak beam, stood a figure that made me freeze completely. It was human-shaped but perfectly still, wearing a long robe that looked deep red in my flashlight's glow. The hood was pulled up, hiding the person's face completely. They stood with their hands at their sides, not moving at all, like a statue placed in the middle of this underground space. I moved closer, my footsteps echoing in the vast chamber. The figure didn't react to the sound of my approach or the light from my phone. They just stood there, motionless, as if they'd been waiting in that exact position for hours or days. When I got within 10 feet, they spoke without lifting their head or moving in any other way. "You came. Good. Your father was right about you." The voice was unlike anything I'd ever heard, not male or female, not young or old. It sounded like it was coming from everywhere and nowhere at once, echoing strangely in the chamber in a way that made it impossible to tell if the person was facing me or had their back turned. "Where's my son?" I demanded, keeping my phone's light trained on the red-robed figure. They didn't answer my question. Instead, they began speaking in that same ageless, directionless voice. Willow Creek exists under a compact that has protected this community for more than a century. The Great Watcher extends its influence over this place, ensuring prosperity, safety, and stability in exchange for a simple offering. One child every 4 years. The arrangement has served both parties well. What are you talking about? Where is Nate? Your parents understood the necessity when their time came. Every family learns the truth when their children reach the vulnerable age. It is the price of belonging to this community. I stepped closer, my light moving with me. My parents never told me about any of this. They prepared you as much as they could, the phrase they taught you, the ability to recognize the pattern, the understanding that some truths must be lived rather than explained. The words my father had repeated whenever I asked about the disappeared children came back to me. Keep walking. Not advice about ignoring problems, but literal instructions for this moment. Directions that had led me down the trail and into this chamber where my son was being held by people who talked about child sacrifice like it was a community service project. This is insane. You can't just take children. People will notice. The police will investigate. The police know. The teachers know. The business owners, the city council, the families who have lived here for generations. Everyone understands their role in maintaining the compact. Those who cannot accept the arrangement leave town. Those who stay become part of it. I thought about all the adults at the parade who had turned away when I asked about Nate. The polite dismissal, the lack of concern, the way conversations died when I approached. They hadn't been indifferent to a missing child. They'd been participating in something they all understood but couldn't discuss openly. The Great Watcher has protected Willow Creek from economic collapse, natural disasters, and outside interference for over 100 years. In return, the community provides what it requires. The offering maintains the balance. You're talking about murdering children. The figure turned slightly, and I caught a glimpse of what might have been a face under the hood, though the shadows made it impossible to see any features clearly. Your parents faced the same choice you face now. They selected a child to take your place when you reached the vulnerable age. But the Great Watcher's influence works in ways we do not always predict. The child they chose was taken before they could act directly. My blood went cold. What child? Carrie Johnson. Your parents had made their selection, but the offering was completed during the parade through the Watcher's own intervention. That is why they seemed so disturbed by her disappearance. They had prepared themselves to make the sacrifice, but the choice was taken from them. The image of Carrie sitting next to me at the parade, her bright yellow dress and gap-toothed smile, hit me with devastating clarity. My parents hadn't just known about her disappearance. They'd been planning it. They'd chosen her to die so I could live. But something had happened that took the decision out of their hands. They carried that guilt for the rest of their lives, the figure continued. The knowledge that they had been willing to destroy another family to save their own son. It is a burden that every parent in this community eventually bears. I understood now why my father had looked so aged during our confrontation about the missing children, why my mother had grabbed my shoulders so desperately when I pressed for answers. They hadn't just been protecting a community secret. They'd been living with the knowledge that they'd marked a 6-year-old girl for death. The Great Watcher provides, and the Great Watcher requires. The compact continues, because both sides benefit from the arrangement. Your son has been selected for this cycle's offering, but you have the same choice your parents had, the same choice every family faces when their time comes. What choice? For the first time since I'd entered the chamber, the figure moved. It raised one arm, pointing toward a section of the room that my flashlight hadn't reached yet. You can accept the offering, or you can select a replacement. I turned my phone's light in the direction they were pointing and saw another alcove carved into the stone wall. Inside it, sitting on what looked like a simple wooden chair, was Nate. He was alive and apparently unharmed, but he sat completely still. His eyes open but unfocused, like he was seeing something very far away. The tricorn hat from his costume was gone, and his small hands rested motionless in his lap. What did you do to him? The Great Watcher has already accepted him. He feels no fear or confusion, but the final offering has not yet been completed. You have time to make your decision. I started toward the alcove, but the figure spoke again, and something in their voice made me stop. Choose carefully. The decision cannot be undone, and the consequences extend beyond this moment. The Great Watcher's influence reaches far beyond Willow Creek's boundaries. Those who attempt to flee the compact face misfortune that follows them wherever they go. Your parents learned this truth. So did others who tried to escape their obligations. The car accident that had killed my parents suddenly took on a different meaning. They'd been coming back from grocery shopping, a normal trip on a familiar road, but the truck that hit them had experienced mysterious brake failure that couldn't be explained by mechanical inspection. The choice is simple, the figure continued. Accept the offering or provide a replacement, but decide quickly. The Great Watcher grows impatient, and the compact must be fulfilled before this day ends. I looked at my son, sitting motionless in that stone alcove, and understood that everything I'd believed about my life, my family, and my community had been built on lies and blood. The peaceful prosperity of Willow Creek came at a price that someone had to pay every 4 years, and now it was my turn to decide who would make that payment. The great sacrificer waited in silence, giving me time to absorb the full horror of what they were offering. Save my son by condemning another child, or lose Nate to maintain a system that had been feeding on children for generations. Either way, I would become part of the conspiracy that had shaped my entire life without my knowledge. Either way, I would carry the same guilt that had broken my parents and every other family that had been forced to participate in Willow Creek's dark prosperity. The compact demanded its offering, and the Great Watcher was waiting for my decision. My legs felt unsteady as the full weight of what I was being asked to do settled over me. The great sacrificer stood motionless in that red robe, waiting for my answer with the patience of someone who had witnessed this scene dozens of times before. "Show me where he is," I managed to say. Without speaking, the figure began walking toward the alcove they had pointed to earlier. I followed, my phone's flashlight beam bouncing with each step across the rough stone floor. The chamber seemed even larger now, with shadows stretching beyond the reach of my light in every direction. As we got closer, I could see Nate more clearly. He sat perfectly upright in what looked like a chair carved directly from the stone wall. His small hands rested flat on his thighs, and his eyes stared straight ahead without blinking. He looked peaceful, almost serene, but completely unlike himself. Nate never sat still for more than 30 seconds under normal circumstances. "What did you do to him?" I whispered. "The Great Watcher has already accepted him," the great sacrificer replied. "He feels no distress or confusion. The influence soothes those who have been chosen." I stepped closer to my son, close enough to see that he was breathing normally. His chest rose and fell in a steady rhythm, and his skin had a healthy color. But when I said his name, he didn't react at all. His eyes didn't track my movement or acknowledge my presence. "But you have a choice, as all parents do," the figure continued. "You can leave your son here to fulfill the compact, or you can select another child to take his place." The words hit me like physical blows. I had to grab onto the stone wall to keep from falling over as the implications crashed through my mind. They were asking me to choose another family's child to die, to condemn some other parent to the same agony I was experiencing right now. I couldn't finish the sentence. The idea was so horrible that I couldn't even say it out loud. The great sacrificer reached into their robe and withdrew a thick book bound in dark leather. The binding looked old, worn smooth by decades of handling. They held it out toward me. "Choose quickly. The Watcher grows impatient." I stared at the book without taking it. "I can't do that. I won't." "Then your son remains here." "No." I shook my head, backing away from both the book and the alcove where Nate sat in his unnatural stillness. "I'm taking him home. We're leaving town. Tonight. Many have attempted that path. None have succeeded." The figure's voice carried a note of something that might have been pity. They set the book down on a ledge carved into the stone wall, then turned to face me more directly. Even with my flashlight pointed at them, I still couldn't make out any features under that deep hood. The Great Watcher's influence extends far beyond Willow Creek's borders. Any family that tries to escape the compact will face terrible consequences. Accidents, illness, financial ruin. The misfortunes will continue until the debt is paid in full. I thought again about my parents' car accident. The truck with mysteriously failed brakes that had killed them both on a routine trip to the grocery store. Had they been trying to leave? Had they finally decided they couldn't live with the knowledge of what they'd almost done to Carrie Johnson? The protection the Great Watcher provides comes with obligations, the figure continued. Those obligations cannot be abandoned simply by crossing the town limits. The compact is binding regardless of geography. My phone buzzed with another text, probably from Sarah asking where I was. The parade would be ending soon, and she'd expect me to return with Nate. She'd want to know where we'd been, why it had taken so long to find a bathroom. I looked at my son again, sitting motionless in that stone chair. 3 years old, wearing the Revolutionary War costume his mother had sewn for him, completely unaware that his life hung in the balance while his father wrestled with an impossible decision. The only way to protect your son is to participate in the system, the great sacrificer said, as your parents did, as their parents did, as every family in Willow Creek eventually must. I picked up the leather book with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. The cover was smooth and cold, like it had been stored somewhere underground for a very long time. When I opened it, the pages were filled with handwritten entries in careful script, names, addresses, ages, notes about family situations. The organization was methodical and thorough. Children were listed by age, then by family circumstances. Notes in the margins indicated which families had deep roots in the community and which were newcomers. Some entries had additional information about parents' jobs, financial situations, social connections. I recognized most of the names. Kids I'd seen playing at the park on weekends. Children from Nate's daycare who I'd watched grow from toddlers to preschoolers over the past year. Neighbors' grandchildren who visited during holidays. Each name represented a family that would be destroyed if I made that choice. Parents who would spend the rest of their lives wondering what had happened to their child. Siblings who would grow up with gaps in their memories that could never be filled. But the alternative was losing Nate. My finger moved down the pages, past names I knew well, past children whose parents were my friends or coworkers. I couldn't do that to people I cared about. I couldn't choose the daughter of someone Sarah worked with, or the son of our neighbors who'd helped us move furniture when we first came back to town. Then I found it, a name that made me pause. Toby Brown. Age 4. Family had moved to Willow Creek 6 months ago when his father took a job at the manufacturing plant. No extended family in the area. Mother worked part-time at a diner on the edge of town. New to the community, few social connections. I stared at the entry for a long time, reading the notes that had been written in the margins. The Browns rented a small house on Maple Street, 3 blocks from where we lived. I'd seen the boy playing in their front yard sometimes when I drove past. Small for his age, dark hair, always seemed to be by himself. They were outsiders, new to town without the deep roots that connected other families to Willow Creek's history and prosperity. If something happened to their son, they wouldn't have generations of relatives asking questions or demanding investigations. They'd grieve and eventually move away, leaving behind only fading memories of a tragedy that no one else would discuss. The practical calculation was clear and horrible. Toby Brown was the logical choice, the choice that would cause the least disruption to the community, affect the fewest people, generate the least suspicion. I closed my eyes, but I could still see Nate sitting in that stone chair, blank and motionless under whatever influence the Great Watcher had placed on him. My son, who'd been so excited about the parade this morning, who'd asked me 17 times if the fire trucks would have their sirens on. When I opened my eyes again, my finger was pointing at Toby Brown's name. "This one," I said, my voice barely audible in the vast chamber. The great sacrificer moved closer, looking down at the page I had selected. They nodded once, a gesture that seemed both final and ritualistic. "The choice is made. The compact will be fulfilled." I wanted to take it back immediately, to slam the book closed and demand some other solution, but the words had already been spoken, and something in the chamber's atmosphere had changed. The air felt heavier, charged with an energy that made the hair on my arms stand up. "What happens now?" I asked. "You return to the parade. Your son will remember nothing of this. Take him home and continue your life. The offering will be completed according to the Great Watcher's design." The figure walked back to the alcove where Nate sat. They placed one hand on my son's forehead, and immediately his eyes began to focus. The blank stare disappeared, replaced by the normal awareness of a 3-year-old who'd just woken up from a nap. "Daddy?" Nate looked around the stone chamber with confusion but no fear. "Where are we?" I rushed to him, lifting him from the chair and holding him against my chest. He felt warm and solid and completely normal, like himself again. Whatever the Great Watcher had done to keep him calm was already fading. "We're going home, buddy," I said, carrying him away from the alcove and toward the tunnel entrance. "Let's go find Mommy." As we reached the opening that led back to the carved steps, the great sacrificer spoke once more. "The compact protects all who honor it. Remember that in the years to come." I didn't reply. I just kept walking, carrying my son up the stone steps toward the surface world, toward the sounds of the parade and the life we would continue living. But everything had changed in that underground chamber. I had made a choice that would haunt me forever, trading one child's life for another's, becoming part of the same conspiracy that had shaped my entire existence without my knowledge. By the time we emerged from the tunnel and pushed through the curtain of vines, Nate was asking about the parade floats he'd missed. He had no memory of the chamber, the great sacrificer, or the terrible choice that had just been made on his behalf. But I would remember everything. The weight of that leather book in my hands, the moment when I pointed to Toby Brown's name, the look of my son sitting motionless in that stone chair. I had saved Nate's life by condemning another child, and that knowledge would be with me for the rest of my days. The compact had claimed another family, and I was no longer just a witness to Willow Creek's dark tradition. I was a participant, bound by the same silence and guilt that had broken my parents and every other adult who'd been forced to make the same impossible choice. We walked back through the woods toward the church, toward the parade sounds and the normal world where my wife was probably frantic with worry. I would tell her I'd found Nate playing behind the building, that he'd wandered off during the bathroom trip. She would believe me because she had no reason not to, and life would continue as if nothing had happened. But somewhere in town, Toby Brown was running out of time, and I was the one who had sealed his fate. The great sacrificer stepped back from Nate, their red robe rustling in the vast chamber. My son blinked a few times, his eyes clearing as whatever influence had held him began to fade. "Your son will remember nothing of this," the figure said, their ageless voice echoing off the stone walls. "Take him home and continue your life." I lifted Nate from the carved chair, feeling his small body relax against my chest. He was warm and solid, completely himself again. The blank stare was gone, replaced by the normal confusion of a 3-year-old who'd woken up somewhere unexpected. "The compact is sealed," the great sacrificer continued. "Return to your family. The offering will be completed according to the Great Watcher's design." I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. I'd made my choice, pointed my finger at a name in that leather book, and condemned another child to save my own. The weight of what I'd done settled over me like a physical burden as I carried Nate toward the tunnel entrance. "Daddy, where are we?" Nate asked, looking around the chamber with mild curiosity but no fear. "We're going back to the parade, buddy," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Mommy's waiting for us." I navigated the carved steps carefully, one hand on the stone wall for balance while holding Nate with the other. My phone's flashlight cast moving shadows on the tunnel walls as we climbed toward the surface. Each step took us further from that underground chamber where I'd become something I'd never imagined I could be. By the time we reached the entrance, pushing through the curtain of vines that hid the opening, Nate was chattering about the parade floats he remembered seeing. The influence of whatever the Great Watcher had done to keep him calm was completely gone. He had no memory of the chamber, the great sacrificer, or the terrible minutes when his life had hung in the balance. "Did the fire trucks make noise?" he asked as we walked back through the woods toward the church. "Yeah, they were pretty loud," I lied, unable to remember anything about fire trucks or sirens. The parade felt like it had happened in another lifetime, though less than an hour had passed since I'd led him away from Sarah. We emerged from the tree line behind the Methodist church just as distant parade music was winding down. Nate pointed toward the main street, where we could see people beginning to disperse from the celebration. "Can we go see the end?" he asked. "Let's find Mommy first," I said, pulling out my phone to check the messages I'd ignored while underground. 7 texts from Sarah, each one more frantic than the last. "Where are you? I can't find you anywhere. People are saying they haven't seen you. Daryl, please answer. I'm getting really scared. Someone said they saw you walking toward the church. I'm coming to look for you." I typed back quickly. "Found him. Behind the church. Coming to find you now." We walked around the building toward Main Street, where the crowd was breaking up into smaller groups. Parents were gathering their children, folding up lawn chairs and heading toward parked cars. The festive atmosphere was fading as people began the transition from celebration back to normal life. I spotted Sarah near the bank where we'd originally claimed our spot. She was talking animatedly to Mrs. Chen and Mr. Rodriguez, gesturing with her hands in a way that meant she was explaining something urgent. When she saw us approaching, her face went through a rapid succession of expressions: relief, anger, confusion, and back to relief. "Where have you been?" She rushed toward us, reaching for Nate before I could hand him over. "I've been looking everywhere. People were helping me search." "Sorry," I said, letting her take Nate into her arms. "He wandered off while I was waiting outside the bathroom. I found him playing behind the church." Sarah hugged Nate tightly, checking him over like she was making sure all his parts were still there. "You scared Mommy so much," she said. "Don't run off like that again." "I didn't run off," Nate protested. "I was with Daddy." "You went to play behind the church," I said quickly, catching his eyes. "Remember? You wanted to look at the trees." Nate considered this for a moment, then nodded. "Oh yeah, there were big trees." Sarah looked back and forth between us, and I could see her trying to piece together a timeline that made sense. "You were gone for almost an hour. What took so long?" "He was pretty far back in the woods. Took me a while to find him, then we had to make our way back through all the trees." The lies came easier than I'd expected, flowing naturally as if I'd been practicing them. "You know how kids can hide in places you'd never think to look." Mrs. Chen approached us, her face showing genuine concern. "Oh, good. You found him. We were getting worried." "Thank you for helping look," Sarah said. I was starting to panic. Mr. Rodriguez joined the group, giving me a nod that seemed to carry more weight than a simple greeting. "Glad everything worked out," he said. "Kids can disappear so quickly at these big events." Something in his tone made me look at him more carefully. He was watching me with the same expression I'd seen on other longtime residents when I'd asked about Nate during my desperate search. Not quite pity, not quite guilt, but something that suggested shared understanding. We spent a few more minutes accepting thanks from neighbors who'd helped Sarah organize the search. Everyone seemed genuinely relieved that the family was reunited, though I noticed several older residents looking at me with that same knowing expression Mr. Rodriguez had worn. The walk home took us past houses where people were grilling hamburgers and setting up for 4th of July barbecues. Everything looked completely normal, like nothing had changed in the time I'd been underground making deals with creatures that fed on children. Nate ran ahead, picking up small American flags that had fallen from parade floats, chattering about everything he'd seen. Sarah walked beside me, occasionally reaching over to squeeze my hand. "I'm sorry I got so panicked," she said. "It's just that people kept saying they hadn't seen you. And with all your anxiety about July 4th, I started imagining worst-case scenarios." "It's okay," I said. "I would have been worried too. Maybe next year we should stick together during the whole parade. Use the buddy system." Next year. The phrase made my stomach clench as I thought about what would happen in 4 years when it was someone else's turn to face the choice I'd just made. Nate would be 7 then, old enough to understand more about the world around him, but still too young to comprehend the dark tradition that had protected him. We spent the rest of the afternoon in our backyard where Sarah grilled hot dogs and Nate played with sidewalk chalk. Normal family activities that felt strange and precious after what I'd been through. I found myself watching my son constantly, grateful for every laugh and every moment of his complete, innocent happiness. As evening approached, neighbors began setting up lawn chairs for the fireworks display that would cap off the holiday. I was helping Sarah carry plates inside when Mrs. Patterson from across the street called out to us. "Did you hear about the Brown family?" she asked, walking over with her dish towel still in her hands. Sarah paused in the doorway. "What about them?" "They're moving. Left town this morning right in the middle of the parade. Can you believe it?" My blood went cold, but I kept my expression neutral. "Really? That's sudden." "Very sudden," Mrs. Patterson agreed. "Mrs. Henderson saw moving trucks at their house early this morning. Said they only took the essentials, left most of their furniture behind." Sarah frowned. "That seems strange. Did something happen?" "No one knows. The Jenkins family next door said they heard raised voices around dawn, but thought it was just the TV. By the time people got home from the parade, the house was empty." I forced myself to participate in the conversation, asking appropriate questions and making the right concerned noises. But every word felt like another layer of complicity, another step deeper into the conspiracy that had claimed my family. "I heard Mr. Brown got transferred suddenly for work," Mrs. Patterson continued. "Emergency situation at his company. Had to pack up and leave immediately." The cover story was already forming, spreading through the neighborhood with the efficiency of a well-practiced routine. By tomorrow, everyone would know that the Brown family had moved away for perfectly reasonable employment-related reasons. Within a week, most people would barely remember they'd ever lived here. Just like Tommy Rodriguez. Just like Billy Martinez. Just like Carrie Johnson. After Mrs. Patterson went back to her own preparations, Sarah shook her head sympathetically. Poor family, having to uproot their whole life so suddenly, especially with a young child. "Yeah," I managed. "That must be really hard." She went back inside to finish cleaning up, but I stayed on the porch, looking toward the house on Maple Street where the Brown family had lived. The windows were dark, and I could see that the small tricycle Toby had ridden in the front yard was gone. I thought about the 4-year-old boy I'd seen playing by himself in that yard, the child whose name I'd pointed to in a leather book underground. I wondered if his parents would ever really understand what had happened to him, or if they'd spend the rest of their lives believing whatever story they needed to tell themselves to keep functioning. The fireworks began just after sunset, bright explosions of color against the darkening sky. Nate sat on my lap in a lawn chair, clapping and pointing at each burst of light. Sarah leaned against my shoulder, her hand resting on Nate's back. "Beautiful night," she said softly. "Yeah," I agreed, though the word felt hollow. Everything was beautiful and normal, and exactly as it should be for a family celebrating Independence Day in a small American town. Except I now knew the price that had been paid for our peace and prosperity. As the grand finale lit up the sky with cascading streams of gold and silver, I realized I was no longer just a witness to Willow Creek's dark tradition. I was a participant, bound by the same silence and guilt that had shaped my parents' lives. The knowledge that had tortured me throughout my childhood, the pattern of disappeared children, the conspiracy of silence, the terrible truth underlying our community's success, was now mine to carry forward. The compact had claimed another family, and I had been the instrument of that claiming. In saving my son, I had condemned another child, and that choice would be with me for the rest of my life. Tomorrow, people would talk about how suddenly the Brown family had left town. Within a few days, new residents would probably move into their house, and life would continue exactly as it always had. The 4th of July parade would become a pleasant memory, and plans would begin for next year's celebration. Nate fell asleep in my arms as the last fireworks faded from the sky. I carried him inside and tucked him into bed, watching his peaceful face in the dim light from the hallway. He was safe, protected by the same terrible system that had claimed so many other children throughout Willow Creek's history. I had saved him by becoming part of the conspiracy I'd spent my entire life trying to understand. Now I was one of the adults who would turn away when desperate parents asked about missing children. One of the residents who would nod knowingly at other participants while maintaining absolute silence about the town's dark secret. The Great Watcher had its offering, and the compact continued for another 4 years. But the price of that protection was measured in more than children's lives. It was measured in the souls of parents who had been forced to make impossible choices, condemned to live with knowledge that could never be shared or forgiven. I was now one of them, and nothing would ever be the same. I sat in my father's old leather chair, the same one where he'd read his evening paper while carrying secrets that had aged him beyond his years. 6 months had passed since that July morning when I'd walked out of an underground chamber with my son in my arms, and another child's death on my conscience. The notebook lay open in my lap, blank except for 2 words I'd written at the top of the page. "Keep walking," my father's phrase. The only guidance he'd been able to give me, cryptic words that had seemed meaningless until I understood they were literal instructions for the most important day of my life. Now I was faced with the same impossible task he'd struggled with: how to prepare your child for a truth that could only be lived, never explained. Outside, snow covered the front yards of Willow Creek, and the Christmas decorations had finally come down from most houses. Normal life continued exactly as it always had. Mrs. Patterson still walked her dog past our house every morning at 7:30. The Hendersons still fought loudly enough for the whole neighborhood to hear. The Jenkins family still had their lawn ornaments arranged in precise rows that somehow never looked quite right. Nobody mentioned the Brown family anymore. Their house on Maple Street had new residents by August, a young couple with no children who worked in the city and commuted daily. The realtor had told people the Browns left behind most of their furniture when they moved, which explained why the house sold so quickly and why moving trucks were seen coming rather than going. Sarah accepted this explanation without question, like she accepted everything else about our town. She'd attributed my mood swings over the past 6 months to stress from my job at the insurance office, suggesting I take more vacation days or maybe talk to Dr. Martinez about anxiety medication. She had no idea that some problems couldn't be solved with better work-life balance. I'd become skilled at recognizing the other participants. They revealed themselves through small gestures, a nod when passing on the sidewalk, a brief pause in conversation when certain topics came up, the way their expressions changed when they looked at Nate playing in our front yard. Mr. Rodriguez had been the first to acknowledge our shared understanding. 2 weeks after the parade, he'd stopped me outside the hardware store and asked how I was settling into my new responsibilities. When I'd looked confused, he'd clarified, "Being part of something bigger than yourself. It takes adjustment." Mrs. Chen from the post office had been more direct. She'd leaned across the counter while selling me stamps and said quietly, "The first year is the hardest. After that, you learn to live with it." Even Mrs. Peterson, my former first-grade teacher, had approached me at the grocery store in September. She'd looked at my cart, noted the extra snacks and juice boxes I was buying for Nate, and said, "You're a good father. Your parents would be proud of how you protected your boy." Each interaction was a reminder that I belonged to a select group now, bound together by knowledge we could never discuss openly. We were the adults who understood what Willow Creek really was and what it demanded for its continued prosperity, the ones who'd made the choice and learned to live with the consequences. I'd started watching other parents more carefully, trying to identify who else carried this burden. The Williamses, whose daughter had been the right age 4 years ago, often looked tired in a way that went beyond normal parenting exhaustion. Mr. Martinez avoided eye contact when we passed on the street, and I remembered Tommy Rodriguez had been his grandson. There were probably a dozen families in town who'd faced the same decision I had. Parents who'd pointed to a name in that leather book and condemned someone else's child to save their own. We formed an invisible network of guilt and silence, recognizing each other through subtle signs while maintaining the facade of normal community life. The worst part was how easily I'd adapted to the routine. I went to work each day, helped Sarah with household tasks, played with Nate in the backyard, attended town council meetings and school board functions. From the outside, I looked like any other involved father and community member. Nobody could see the knowledge that had fundamentally changed everything about how I understood the world. Sarah noticed I'd become quieter, more thoughtful, but she attributed it to maturity. "You seem more settled," she'd said last month. "Like you've finally made peace with living here." In a way, she was right. I had made peace with Willow Creek, but not in any way she could imagine. I'd stopped fighting against the town's dark tradition and become part of it instead. The anxiety that had plagued me throughout my childhood and early adulthood was gone, replaced by the terrible certainty that comes from understanding your place in an ancient system. I'd saved my son, and that was all that mattered. The guilt would never leave, but I'd learned to carry it the same way my father had, like a weight that became part of your body, uncomfortable but manageable, changing how you moved through the world but not preventing you from functioning. Nate was thriving. He'd started preschool in the fall and made friends easily, showing no lingering effects from his brief time under the Great Watcher's influence. He remembered nothing about the parade except the fire trucks and the candy, exactly as the great sacrificer had promised. Sometimes I watched him playing with his toys or laughing at something on television, and I felt overwhelmed by gratitude that he was still here, still mine, still safe. But that safety came with an expiration date. In 4 years, when the next cycle arrived, some other parent would face the choice I'd made. 4 years after that, it would be someone else's turn. The pattern would continue indefinitely, claiming one child every election cycle to maintain the Great Watcher's protection. Eventually, Nate would grow old enough to notice the pattern himself. He'd ask questions about children who moved away suddenly, just as I had. He'd become obsessed with understanding what happened to kids like Carrie Johnson and Billy Martinez and Tommy Rodriguez. And someday, when he had children of his own, he'd find himself walking that trail behind the Methodist Church, carrying his own child into that underground chamber where impossible choices waited. I picked up my pen and started writing below the "Keep Walking" heading. Behind the Methodist church, where the grass meets the woods, look for the gap between two oak trees. Small stones mark the entrance. Follow the trail downhill until it disappears, then push through the vines to find the carved opening in the rock face. Take a flashlight. The tunnel goes down about 50 feet before opening into a large chamber. You'll find the great sacrificer waiting in the center, wearing a red robe. They'll explain the compact and give you the same choice I faced. I chose Toby Brown because his family was new to town and had no local connections. It was the practical decision, the one that would cause the least disruption to the community. I'm not proud of what I did, but I saved you. I stopped writing and stared at the words on the page. How do you explain to your child that you condemned another child to death? How do you prepare them for the moment when they'll have to make the same choice? My father had tried to teach me through hints and warnings, preparing me gradually for a truth he couldn't speak directly. The phrase, "keep walking," had been his way of telling me that sometimes you have no choice but to move forward, even when every step takes you deeper into moral compromise. Now I understood the weight he'd carried, the knowledge that had made him age rapidly during my teenage years. He'd chosen Carrie Johnson to save me, or at least been willing to, and that decision had haunted him for the rest of his life. The car accident that killed both my parents might not have been an accident at all. It might have been the Great Watcher collecting its debt from people who could no longer live with their participation in the compact. I added another paragraph to my instructions. The town's prosperity isn't an accident. Our low crime rate, economic stability, good schools, and protection from natural disasters, all of it comes from the Great Watcher. The compact has protected Willow Creek for over a century, ensuring that families like ours can live safely and prosperously. But that protection requires sacrifice. Every 4 years, one child between the ages of 5 and 7 must be offered to maintain the balance. Parents who refuse to participate face terrible consequences that extend far beyond the town limits. The only way to protect your family is to become part of the system. I hope you never have to use this information. I hope you'll move away before starting a family, find somewhere else to build your life. But if you stay, if you choose to raise your children here, you need to understand what that choice means. The words looked stark and horrible on the page, but they were necessary. Nate deserved to know the truth about his heritage, about the price that had been paid for his safety and the cost of continuing to live in Willow Creek. I closed the notebook and locked it in the desk drawer where I kept important documents. Someday, when Nate was old enough to understand, I'd give him the same conversation my father had tried to give me. I'd tell him about patterns and choices and the weight of protecting the people you love. But for now, he was only 3 years old, safely asleep upstairs while snow fell quietly outside our windows. For now, he could remain innocent of the knowledge that would someday shape his life, just as it had shaped mine. The compact continued, and Willow Creek prospered, and families like ours lived protected lives built on a foundation of terrible necessity. The cycle would repeat every 4 years for as long as the town existed, claiming one child to save all the others, maintained by parents who understood that sometimes love requires making choices that destroy your soul. I was part of that system now, bound by the same silence and guilt that had defined my parents' lives. The pattern I'd spent 20 years trying to understand had claimed me completely, transforming me from witness to participant, to eventually the person responsible for passing the knowledge to the next generation. In 4 years, it would be someone else's turn to walk that trail and make an impossible choice. And 4 years after that, the cycle would continue. The Great Watcher would receive its offering, and Willow Creek would remain prosperous and protected, and parents like me would carry the weight of what we'd done to keep our children safe. That was the price of paradise in a small American town. It was a price each generation had to pay, and now it was my responsibility to ensure the next generation understood their inheritance. I turned off the lamp and sat in the darkness, listening to the quiet sounds of my family sleeping safely above me. Tomorrow would bring another normal day in our protected community, and I'd play my role as a father and neighbor and contributing member of society. But tonight, I allowed myself to remember Toby Brown, the 4-year-old boy whose life I'd traded for my son's future. The compact was sealed, and the cycle continued. And somewhere in the foundations of our prosperity lay the bones of children whose names were gradually forgotten by everyone except the parents who'd chosen them to die.